Class is now in session. This is EdChoice Chats.
Hello, and welcome back to another edition of EdChoice Chats. This is Mike McShane, Director of National Research at EdChoice, and I'm so happy to be joined by two of my incredibly clever colleagues, Colyn and Cooper. I decided to see, once I saw those two C's, I was like, there's an alliteration opportunity here. But we're going to be talking all about school choice finance today. And I know some of you might be thinking that that's not the most interesting topic. I might agree with you. I might not. No, I would not agree with you about that. I think this is actually a super interesting topic because it's part of a broader conversation that we're having at EdChoice. And I think that the school choice movement in general is really thinking about right now. As programs proliferate, I can't stop with the alliteration. Once I did the Cooper and Colyn, I'm just continuing with this. But as programs proliferate around the country, we think of different funding mechanisms. So we compare like ESA funding versus like what Oklahoma is doing via tax credits versus what other states are doing with vouchers or any of these sorts of things. We have to develop a kind of new vocabulary and a new way of thinking about programs, where in the past we had more narrow ways of thinking about them, and where some of the similarities and differences were easier to understand, as we see all these different programs that people tell us are similar to one another, but it's like, well, actually, there are some important differences that are there. And so there's no one way we could do this unless we wanted to do like a 4-hour podcast where we like went in depth and tried to, make some sort of connecting lines and overlapping Venn diagrams. But I think the more helpful way to do this is to break down sort of these things into individual pieces. So what we're going to be talking about today is something that our team has worked to calculate recently. One of these ways we can think about these programs, which is a term we're using called funded eligibility. And so, Colyn, I'll probably start by kicking it over to you. When we talk about this term funded eligibility, what does that mean? And sort of why should we care about it?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Long time no see. This has been a term that's kind of evolved over my time at EdChoice over the last couple of years. We first started when programs were being enacted, many ESA programs in 2021, 2022, talking about eligibility, what it means if a program is limited to students with disabilities or students that come from families making less than 300% of the federal poverty level. And now I feel like we're really diving into the true, drilling as deep as you can into eligibility. What we mean by funded eligibility very simply means how much money is in each program given the average scholarship size, which varies by state. And also, the money, it varies by state, varies by program. And based on that, how many students can actually participate in a program? So I'll segue into Cooper's great work on this. There are states like Arizona, like Florida, where no matter how many students want to participate, and they have in their statute, they have universal eligibility. So it's any K-12, any student in Florida that's eligible to participate in K-12 education, they are able to participate in the program, and the money is there. Now, that's not the case for all states, but Florida and Arizona are a couple of examples with universal funded eligibility. And really, it just means how much money is there for students, given how much they'll get in an average scholarship size. So that's a very basic, layman's way of describing universal funded eligibility.
But it's a super important point that you're making there, because over the course of the past couple of years, as states have passed these different laws, we've thrown around this word universal a lot. And there are quite a few states that have what we would call universal eligibility, in the sense that, sort of as you said, in the past, there were certain restrictions on what students could participate. Oh, you have to be under this level of the poverty line. Oh, you have to be zoned for a D or F school or whatever they are. And those went away, which I think, we as an organization are jazzed about that. Like, that's great. That's what we're going for. We want everybody to be able to participate. But as with all things public policy related, you have to read the fine print, because we see states that say, yep, everybody's eligible, come on in. We're like, oh man, this is great. I wonder what's going to happen here. Like, oh, but there's $10 million in funding or $30 million in funding or whatever. And it's like, as you said, like, wait, I'm going to do some mental math here. And if there's 5,000, the scholarships are capped at $5,000 or something, and there's $30 million, right? You can figure out, oh, wait, that's not actually all the kids in the state that are actually eligible. There's only so many that could do it based on funding. Now, look, obviously some of this is complicated because different states have different rules around whether the scholarship has to be a uniform size or how much goes in there. And you mentioned a point which we can kind of come back to here in a second, of thinking about sort of appropriation funded programs versus formula funded programs. But before we get to that, Cooper, I would be interested in just the mechanics of this. How did we figure this out? What were some of the data sources? How did you do the calculations?
Yeah, so we basically went state by state and tried to figure out, one, how many students are in each state, and then how many students are eligible for each program, and then how much money is actually is allocated to be able to fund these students. So like Colyn was saying, states like Florida and Arizona are universally eligible, and they're also universally funded eligible, meaning that every student who wants to participate in the choice program can actually receive the dollars that can follow them to whatever private educational expense that they so choose to use it on.
And so do you have a good kind of ranking? Can you maybe give us the top 5 or 10 states when it comes to funded eligibility?
Yeah, Florida's probably the best. Ohio as well. It does a really good job. Arizona with their ESA is excellent. Arkansas, as they expand, will do a good job as well in Indiana. But what's interesting is that there's only a handful of states, around 5 programs or so, that have fully funded eligibility right now. And then there's only about 6 more that have funding for over 50% of the students, meaning that every other choice program is under 50%, usually by quite a large amount, making these programs really only eligible to families in name only after those dollars are used up.
So now, Colyn, these 100% programs, the top ones are formula funded, while the others are sort of appropriation funded. Can you maybe walk through the difference between those two?
I can try. We have a colleague, Marty Lucan, who is an expert at this stuff. And the only reason he's not here is because he's helping to do this exact work in states that are looking to, follow the path of states like Arizona, Florida. So I'm trying to fill some shoes here, and I'm going to do my best. So I'd also like to plug some of the work that my colleague, Ed Tarnowski, has done. He has a fantastic article on EdNext, kind of walking through the differences in universality and sort of what separates states from one another. From our experience and what we stand for at EdChoice is, we believe formula funding is the best way to go, and that's the path Florida, Arizona, Arkansas have gone down, and that provides the most amount of money for students because it's connected to money in the public schools. Going down from there, we're looking at appropriation and things of that nature. So sort of what Cooper is saying, and one of the more glaring examples, think about a state like North Carolina, where North Carolina, for those familiar with the choice landscape, North Carolina has pretty robust choice. They have a ESA available to students with disabilities. They also have a voucher that is universally eligible, aka every student in the state can participate. They have a funding cap of $191 million, and that number is actually relatively new because they expanded to include students on the wait list. So before that, it was roughly, I think it was like 73 million, which again, talking about these numbers is sort of, it's an odd experience talking about these numbers to people that aren't familiar, because 73 million is obviously an unfathomable amount of money. But when we're thinking about these programs where, from our perspective, EdChoice, we want every student in the state to be able to participate. 73 million, given the average scholarship size, it's actually kind of shockingly low. I think it's something like 30,000 students can participate, which for a state like North Carolina with nearly 1.8 million students, 30,000 is an incredibly small fraction of that population. So North Carolina has actually done a decent job of expanding that to include all students in the wait list. I believe the budget cap is now somewhere closer to 200 million. And that allows for the funding of nearly 90,000 students, which again is fantastic progress from where they've been. That is still a fraction of their total student population. So it's a very nuanced conversation, and one that is going to be evolving over the course of the next decade or so as states try and figure out how to best fund their programs. But Florida, Arizona, Arkansas, the ones that are tied, formula funded and tied to, can go up as more students want to participate. That's kind of the golden ticket here, and that's the one that states should shoot for.
Yeah, and there's kind of a prudential question, right? Like, by choosing to do things via formula funding. I mean, like that, as you mentioned, that very neatly ties into the way that we fund other students that are in the system. It gives us an idea how to calculate how much they're owed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of positives to that. But that really is a commitment on the part of states. So it makes sense that even in states that I think in Arizona, maybe these programs started 15 years ago with an appropriation that says, okay, we're going to start this program and it's going to be $20 million and we're going to see how it goes. And if it crashes and burns, we're only out $20 million, which again, to a state, to any of us, burning through $20 million would be a lot. Though I bet you I could. If anyone wants to give it to me and see if I could, I'm more than happy to give it a try. Like an early round draft pick in the NFL in the 1990s, I bet you I can blow through $20 million. But we do, recognize that these things eventually kind of hit a ceiling because the appropriations get large enough that it's like, well, at some point you're appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars. It's much easier to just work this through the funding formula. And again, for folks who may not be familiar with this, most states, though again, as Marty Lucan has painstakingly explained to me and others over the course of many years, each state's funding formula is its own special snowflake that has its own characteristics. And I'm willing to contend, Marty is one of the only people in America that understands like multiple states' funding formulas, because even within states, very few people truly understand their funding formula. I remember in a past life working on like an explainer of Missouri's funding formula, and it stretched, 30, 40 pages long to understand all the different calculations that are put in of how much money is a particular student owed. And it's some, function of local property tax dollars, state support, federal dollars with multipliers for any number of things. If it's a student with special needs, if they're an English language learner, poverty, and then it gets really interesting because it could be some states do, you get a little more money if you're in a district with a growing population, which again, sort of makes sense as economies of scale have to work. But they'll even you can get more money if you're in a district with a declining population. So they get you coming or going any way that you want to do those things. But to be honest, a lot of those things make sense if we think that different students cost different amounts to educate. And if they're trying to learn the English language, or if they're coming from disadvantage, or if they're in an isolated rural area, like lots of reasons why we think that might be true. I think there's also like a strong case that those things are also probably true if they're attending a non-public school option, right? So creating programs that link those things. And I think we see, especially, you see some of the reports out of Arizona and others for the students that participate with special needs, where their funding can follow them. And some of the children that participate in these programs have really profound special needs and are quite expensive to educate. And so capping that scholarship amount at a much lower level is basically saying that those students aren't going to be able to be served. But you can see in the reports, I think they sort of publish the bands of how much funding each individual students get. So this is allowing for students with more profound special needs, and I think ultimately can help students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a kind of old school idea in economics and in political science of adverse selection. This was big during like the Obamacare debates. If you give everybody the same healthcare subsidy, but people have different levels of health, you're pushing people to want to serve the healthiest people because the subsidy is greater than the cost. And it's encouraging you to adversely select, or it's accusing you or pushing you to push away people whose healthcare is more expensive because the cost will be more than the subsidy. And look, I think education is no different. If we think kids cost different things to educate and we have a uniform subsidy for all of them, it's going to encourage schools and others to try and serve kids that cost less than that and push away kids that cost more. So ultimately, as you said, Colyn, pushing this in towards the funding formula is great, though obviously it's a heavier lift. These things are more complicated, so it may have to be something when a program is more mature. When you were, going through any of these numbers, did anything like surprise you? Did anything jump out to you? Was there some state that you were like, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting that? Or were there others where you were just like shamed by how poorly they did? Just anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, Colin and I have talked about this, and probably the most egregious example is Utah. They have a great new ESA bill that's excellent, and it's around $8,000 scholarship. But however, only $80 million are appropriated for students who want to use a scholarship. And so the scholarship this past year was extremely popular, and 10,000 students signed up and used all of the money. However, that means that every other student who signed up is then put on a wait list and wasn't able to actually access the school choice program. And often, we're kind of left at the will of the legislators trying to figure out how much money they're going to appropriate for the scholarship. But what this means is that for families and students who kind of need a change, and Colin knows better than I the polling of why students and families change school. This means that students might be left being bullied at their school right now. Their family isn't able to overcome the financial obstacles of paying for a private education out of pocket. And so that's something that I'm hoping that we see change, and that they add an escalator to their program or increase the appropriation in the future.
Well, I think this is so important too for the kind of supply side response, right? So like, we spend a lot of time talking about the like policy or the funding mechanism or whatever, but like a dollar does not educate a child like a school does. So what we need are great schools to participate in this. And you might imagine at the beginning, it'll be an existing stock of schools that kids will gain access to because of this. But ultimately, we want those schools to either scale up or we want people to open new schools. And the problem is, if every year it's like, well, we have to wait till the end of the legislative session to know how many kids are going to have scholarships. Think of that pitch to like, well, I'm not going to start a school in that environment. Or if I'm already operating a school, it's like, I don't know if I want to risk building a new building to try and accommodate more kids because I don't know if they'll still be there. Look, and this is something that has plagued school choice programs as long as they've been around, this sort of uncertainty. The DC program was like famous for this, which was like so many school leaders are like, look, I want to participate in this, but this is a political football in Congress, and we can't wait till like the 11th hour of every cromnibus or whatever they became known as, the bills that funded the government, to determine whether or not we're going to admit kids or not. It's just not a sustainable way of looking at it. And again, this sort of ties into what Colin was saying earlier about the need for formula funding, because one of the key things of formula funding is a certain measure of predictability, is that, folks can know, hey, if we admit these kids, we can be assured of roughly this amount of money. And I would actually be willing to wager, for so many school leaders, it's like the amount of money is probably less important than the certainty of it, right? Like if you can say like, you'll get less money, but I can promise you'll get it for the next 10 years for students, I would bet more folks would say, as opposed to saying, hey, you can get, 150% of that, but we don't know from year to year how many kids are going to be in there. So again, it's all of these things are sort of like interrelated with one another, and we can get kind of caught up in the shorter term elements of this and the political intrigue. But the real thing is like, it's about the supply, right? Like it's about new schools and what can we do to sort of ensure, hey, if you take the leap and participate in this program, you'll still be able to participate years from now. I'm sort of curious, looking forward, the work that we're doing on this, the impact that you think that it could have, the kind of bigger picture look. What do you see looking forward?
Yeah, it's the most important question, I think, when thinking about this type of thing. And without the great work of like Cooper and Marty Lucan, who have spent a lot of hours on this, making it easy for other team members like myself. And one of the things we are hoping to release in the spring is kind of a comprehensive look at each state and determining how much choice do families have in each state. And that comes down to a couple of different, we've established 3 different pillars. One of them is eligibility. And we went with funded eligibility because we believe that is what we've talked about on here for a while now, is that we believe funded eligibility is the way forward. And Utah is a really great example. And it's just kind of a nuanced debate about what's happening in states overall. And Cooper is absolutely right bringing up Utah. It's deemed universal. Every student could participate. But when it comes to the money, really only 10,000 students can participate. And for us as an organization, we absolutely want to, pat Utah on the back and give them credit. And they deserve tons of credit, because that is a incredibly hard thing to do. And, it's hours and hours and hours of work from lawmakers, parents, advocates, you name it. At the same time, if Utah wants to understand and think about how we can really make educational freedom a reality for every student in their state, they have to increase the money. They have to increase the funds that allow for every student to truly participate. So it's really kind of a fine line of giving states credit, but also thinking where can they go in the future? And the fortunate reality is you can look to states like Florida, Arizona, like the roadmap has already been laid. It's just about kind of getting there, and the work. It's tough. You want to congratulate and celebrate the victories, but there's also so much work left to be done. And even in this work that we're doing, determining states and their true freedom, Florida is about as good as you can get. There's still room for them to grow, and I won't get too far into the weeds there. But their award amount could be higher. It could be closer to what the revenues per pupil in public schools are. So it's not just a Utah problem. It's really a reality for every state, and each state is different, and that's why we're trying to guide states through that.
Well, Colyn, Cooper, I think you're a couple of cool cats. I just had to do it. I had to do it again. But I really appreciate you joining the podcast today. I think this was super helpful. Everyone who's listening, we've published these data on I think by the time this podcast is coming out, it will be timed with us actually publishing these numbers. So we encourage all of you to check that out. Our website's www.edchoice.org. That information will be there. And always, if you have questions, you can find us on all the social media channels and everything like that. So thanks, Colyn. Thanks, Cooper. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And I look forward to chatting with all of you again on the next episode of EdChoice Chats.